one of the problems we have in a workshop is that we're all sitting on different stools, to use an Englishism, and between the stools there's a lot of distance. So we have, if you like, the humanities thus far, and I'm a social scientist, and I'm going to talk a little bit in my ramblings about the problems of doing field work in organisations and how you might get to the substance of ethics. And the way I'm going to do that is just to make bare some of the problems of that trade. Now, my inquiries are about my trade, about how we come to understand what ethical moments might be. There's a lot of distance between that and some of the presentations we've had thus far, and some of the presentations I imagine we will have later on. I think the fun of being here is trying to fathom the distance between them. Okay, so I'm not necessarily going to talk about what you might think of as ethics from the perspective of John Rawls, to put it crudely. I'm going to think about ethics from the perspective of this kind of thing. This is a fantastic new book by a French philosopher who's trying to revive a trade that was famous for the department that's just down the road here that Luciana has something to do with now, ordinary language philosophy. And why am I interested in that? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research as a field worker. And one of the problems of doing field work, one of the problems of doing anthropological or sociological field work is a problem of the right sensibility. It's the problem of what it is you want to look at and how you discover things that matter. Now, years ago, these are my PowerPoint. I wrote a book called Inside the IMF, and it's a study, an ethnographic study of how an organisation that deals with big data, processes that data, documents it, makes decisions. Now, today, a couple of years ago, an anthropologist in the Journal of the Royal Anthropology Institute said this book invented the anthropology of documents, which seems strange to a sociologist, since I would have thought Max Weber might have done that 100 years ago. But nevertheless, what's interesting about it was that they said that this was a profound book, but they said that as a preface before criticising it. And the reason why they criticised it was because my description of how people dealt with data inside the IMF didn't pertain to what anthropologists think you ought to see when you see big data being dealt with. Their view was that I looked at the mundanity of working life when economists in the IMF are trying to think about how to get the work done by 5 p.m. on Friday, whereas the anthropologists wanted me to look at the IMF with a view towards ethics, with a view towards big issues. And in their view, I didn't necessarily look at big issues. Now, this seems a reasonable set of problems. How would you look at big issues? Part of the problem here is, I think, trying to calm yourself as a field worker, to address the world that you see such that you can navigate to those moments when big issues arise. One of the reasons why I bring this particular book, Laurier's book, is because she discusses felicity conditions, which is Austin's notion that to understand the meaning of important concepts like ethics, a key trick for the mental imagination, for the sluggish imagination, is to see how concepts like ethics are used in particular ways. That the felicity conditions in some places might be different from somewhere else. And a famous Parisian sociologist called Bruno Latour says that the problem for contemporary sociology and anthropology is to understand what those felicity conditions are, wherever they are. Once you've done that, you can talk. You can talk to lawyers. You could talk to international relations people. You could talk to ethicists, yet be an anthropologist. That seems reasonable. But what he says later on in this book, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, is that having understood felicity conditions, you can then say to economists that economists have an ideology which strips out morality. If you look at what economists do, they treat human action as merely the seeking of marginal utility. He says that claim strips out human decision-making, strips out the morality of it, takes the ethics out of it. And economics is nevertheless in the business of doing ethics. Now, this perplexes me because if you talk to economists, and in my latest book called Choice, which comes out next month, one of the things economists will say is they're not interested in individual choice. They don't care what people think. They have no interest in how people decide. They're only interested in this imagined entity called a market And you can construct apparatus to distinguish that market, to shape it through aggregate data, where marginal utility is merely the output of the relationship between price and volume. They have no interest in how individual people choose. In fact, if you ask them how individual people choose, they say, talk to a sociologist. Now, why am I mentioning all this? Because it leads me back to the issue of how we think about big data and how you address issues to do with ethics. Another recent argument in sociology, I've got quite a long way to get through, has to do with how you might understand politics at home, politics in the domestic hearth. And a current argument has to do with, okay, we need felicity conditions, and you need to materialise it. So this particular book, which is very fashionable in the sociology literature at the moment, Material Participation, says you can look at material objects in the home and use those to highlight ethical decisions. What she says there is if you look at, for example, toasters, you can use that as an instrument to figure out whether people are sensitive to the ethical decisions they make about energy use. I read that book and I was thinking, this is perplexing. It's very difficult to see how you can get from people using toasters into their mental landscape where they're making real decisions about ethics. Are they thinking about how many times they use the toaster in terms of ethics? Well, maybe they are. But in this book, she says it doesn't matter. As a social scientist, as a field worker, you can assert that they are. And this made me worry about this sort of thing. It made me worry a little bit about how it is you might study what ethics in, for example, organisations like Google might be. And one of the ways I was thinking about this would be to say that if you look at how, say, search engines work, one of the things you might presuppose would be there might be some ethical decisions being made about delivering content. And of course, people like Pariser, for example, argues that's an important criteria that constrains what search targets are delivered to the user. But if you go and talk to search engine engineers, if you go and understand the felicity conditions of their activities, what is it that you find? Well, one of the most startling things, one of the most important changes in search in the past 10 years has been the invention of the mobile phone, and that as a search operation point. And what the problem for search engineers is not to select what they think the user wants, is to select sufficient choices in the system so the user gets some choices quickly. And what they discovered with mobile search is that you can weight the most important criteria for triaging potential choices. And the most important criteria, about 70%, it's a funny way of calculating it, has to do with your location. So if, for example, you're on the Banbury Road here, and you put in a search for Internet Institute, the search engine, whether it's Google or it's my previous company's search engine, will say that the number one criteria for triaging between all the different sorts of targets should be your location. Where's the nearest place which calls itself an internet institution? It would be the Oxford OII. It wouldn't be the internet institutions that are in Brussels and elsewhere. Thereafter, different criteria come into play. The important point about this is that an ethical matter? Is that an ethical issue? Is there something to examine in the operation of search that might lead you to ethical concerns? Well, it seems to me that if you look at it that way, if you look at how search engineers are doing their business, one of the things you find is that they're not making those sorts of ethical considerations. But if you talk to search engineers about other matters, they'll say other interesting things, like they keep all the data that's used when people make these searches. They store big data. So then naturally you want to talk to them about what ethical considerations might apply there. Well, there's two interesting things that they say there. One, they never use this data. They genuinely do not use the data that's stored. They keep it because they have a notion that at some point someone will come up with a trick for using these vast data trails for something useful. So they keep it, they warehouse it. This is not Luciano's argument that information is power. This is an argument which says information is a burden. We store it in these vast cloud warehouses, these vast server farms, and we don't know what to do with it. And having stored it there, in the vague hope that we might do something with it, we create a problem for ourselves because we do make an ethical decision. We've committed ourselves to the idea that information should be secure vis-a-vis the notion of the individual that created it. That information, namely who made a search, shouldn't be visible to anyone. not even to ourselves, except in special circumstances. As it happens, we're obliged to, by legal frameworks, to make that available to certain sorts of governments. So we have to structure our data sources so that strangers, namely governments, can go to that particular source. Why someone might want to do that may be a different sort of issue. But given that, one of the problems the search engineers have, maybe not the kind of point of view engineers have, the people who are storing the data, is they want to know if they can design these structures, these databases, these data stores, these cloud stores, such that they're secure, except at the moment when they are unlocked. One of the things that they know, and one of the things that torments them, one of the things they fret about when they do their ethical reflections, is that they cannot make their systems secure. As one of the chapters in this book I produced last year, George Donisis explains, data is normally made secure by the application that renders it. So for example, a simple example, in Office if you use Word, Word can make your file secure from another Word user. But if you go to the operating system underneath Word actually has the data. So you can bypass Word and go into the operating system and say, can you give me the data file that Word's wrapped up in a secure wrapper when you're inside Word. So in an operating system, you can completely bypass all the secure apparatus which protects data. Why does this matter? Well, because operating systems are also what runs cloud data. So in the cloud data farms, for example, the data searches which are used by Google, for example, or Bing, they're wrapped in a secure envelopes by the search engine protocols. But the data itself is stored by operating systems which are stored on disks. So the search engineers have a problem. They want to try and figure out how to engineer that such that it can be secure. Well, it turns out in principle you cannot make that secure. You must be able to compile data onto an operating system so that it can store, and the compilers are essentially tools which open up an operating system. So even if you make an operating system secure, an operating system which is secure, which has taken the data from the applications, it itself can be unraveled by a compiler. And the great problem for security engineers thus is they know that a clever hacker can break into their secure systems. The problem for them is to come up with short-term hacks which solve each particular potential threat. What they're doing is creating a little door which closes access to the compiler in one way, and that gives them another 3 months, and they come up with another door that closes another way. And as they're doing this, they're watching the world at large of hackers who are trying to hack these sorts of things. Now, how do they get knowledge of these sorts of hackers? Let me tell you a little story. On Friday afternoons in Cambridge, in the computer science lab, the professor of security, Ross Anderson, holds a seminar. And it's a seminar a bit like this. It's hot. It's mostly men. This is computer science. They sit around on Friday afternoons at 3 o'clock. And each week, someone has a task. Someone will deliver a new security algorithm, particularly related to the cloud, and they'll present it. They'll put the algorithm up there and say, this is claimed to be uncrackable. And all of these fellows get themselves up into a lather to see who can break it over the weekend. If not over the weekend, by the next week. So the engine of hackers is not strangers in Moscow. It's the professional defenders of civil rights in Cambridge. It's Ross Anderson's team. Next week, they come along having hacked it. Now, the same people are teaching the search security engineers to build applications, to build algorithms that can defend themselves against precisely their own colleagues. This is the ethical dilemma that they're trying to deal with. Now, what would be a sociology of these things? What would be an anthropology of these sorts of things? An anthropology of these sorts of things entails not the descriptions that we've had thus far of the in-principle arguments about ethics. A sociology tries to evince the felt life of people trying to do these sorts of things. Now, how that fits into these larger arguments about, for example, legal pressures at international relations level, legal pressures from governments on how companies store their data, how they make it manifest, I don't know. I think that's part of the arguments we would like to talk about later on. But let me close my little 20 minutes with an anecdote about field work. My first book, I think, actually I was reflecting on this morning, I dug this out from my library last night. I actually think I've written more books than Florida, which I think is probably fairly impressive, but that's probably because I'm about 10 years older than him. This was my first book, 21 years ago. Now, this book's about the use of new technology in the police, and using, for example, data analysis to make predictions about where crime explosions might be. And one of the things we did, as an anthropologist, sociologist, you do field work. You don't look at the principles of it, you do field work. And one of the things you did, as part of the background of reading field work, is read books. And there are two contrast books I'll just share with you. One of the great books on ethics and sociology is by a guy called Jerome Skolnick, 1966, Justice Without Trial. This is the book which describes the felt life of patrol officers in San Francisco trying to deal with their lived experience of confronting, for example, wife beaters and trying to figure out how to constrain their anger and their bitterness about society that's delivered this wickedness in front of them, such that they could behave processually so that the villains they saw in front of them could be delivered to a court with the right evidence. And one of their problems was they had passions about what was right and what was wrong. They had deeply felt ethical concerns that would muddy their capacity to deliver the villains to the courts. They would want to exert justice without trial because they could see villainy in front of them. They could see people being hurt. They could see small women being beaten by big men. Now, I read that book, and I read another book by Simon Holdaway, an English sociologist, and his book about being inside the police described, this does lead you back to the topic, describes that what police work in England is basically about is men in fast cars with a uniform on, able to break the rules. And in the languors of being a police officer, it's very boring being a police officer. What do? You show off, you be macho, you drive fast, put your lights on, squeal with your tyres as you roar around. Simon Holdaway never spoke about the angst of dealing with criminality. Why was that? Well, why was that was because I think when he went into the field, they recognised, the police officers, the ethical problem that they had wasn't the ethics that they were dealing with. The ethical problem they had was with him. Now, let me explain this issue in terms of my case. When I did research on the police in Lancashire, for many months, I pretended to be a copper. They wouldn't give me a proper uniform because I was too big and they didn't want to invest in buying a new one, and there weren't any off-the-shelf ones I could wear, so I had to pretend to be a detective. Amongst other things, I do night duties, I go all sorts of different sorts of places, but they never let me go to domestic. I didn't go to domestic for 4 months, and then one night they said, Richard, you're okay now, you can go to domestic. So I go to domestic with the sergeant, and we arrive at a house, a little council terrace, and there's a guy standing on the door. It's a late Saturday night, about 11 o'clock, naked, on the door on this terraced house, looking angry, banging on the door. We pull up and we walk over to him and he explains what has happened. He'd come home that night, he's a taxi driver, he didn't have enough business that week, so he didn't make enough money to pay the bills, and he told his wife this when he was in the bath. She lost a rag, smashed the bathroom door down, which had glass in it, went downstairs, stabbed him with a bread knife. He ran downstairs outside the door and was standing there by the door naked saying, I don't want to leave, she's done this before, this is my home, my kids here, I don't want to leave. And we stood there, and I stood there, and the police officer, the sergeant, went inside to talk to the lady to try and get her to calm down so that her husband could come back in. And as I stood there, I realised my feet were getting sticky. And then I looked and it was dark, and there's black stuff on the floor, and it was blood pouring out of this man's feet over the doorstep. And my feet were sticking in the blood. And I said, maybe we should go to the hospital. He said, no, I can't go unless I know I can get back in there. And the sergeant came down and I told him what the situation in the man's feet were. And he persuaded both of them to go to the hospital. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this, that the problem when trying to look at ethics and say, for example, big data and large corporations is how do you do it, how do you study it from, I'm finishing, from a field worker's perspective. The policemen, when I studied them, knew I was a sociologist, I was well educated, I was a southerner, I was probably a bit soft-hearted. So when I would go to a domestic, I would instantly assume it was a woman being duffed up by an evil sexist chauvinist. I would instantly wade in and make a mess of it. What they wanted me to do was to learn that the important thing for policemen is to restrain their ethical judgments and let the situation unfold so that they can make the right decision, so to let others make the ethical decision. For example, the courts in this case, social services, but in this particular instance, let the couple to sort out the mess they've made of their lives and not to wade into it. And one of the problems we have in sociology and anthropology is a lot of the literature on the big corporations, on the sinister nature of the big evil empire, one of which I used to work for, is its descriptions from the outside. And they complain that they can't get inside. They ask me, how did I get access to this sinister organisation? They say this at the same time as saying, we know these organisations are behaving unethically. We know how they behave. We know how they abuse their data. And I'm reminded of that moment when the police sergeant said, tonight you can go to a domestic, because they then trusted me enough to know that I wouldn't prematurely, inappropriately apply my ethical considerations on a situation where I needed to understand the ethical considerations that were coming out of it. And this is what J.L. Austin argued about ethics and words, and meaning you need to have the sensitivity to see how they're coming out in situ, how they come out in the natural place, their accountable place. What Hal Garfinkel said is how work is accountably made in situ, in the context in which that work has some pertinence, some traction. Now, in a workshop about ethics, the contribution that sociology or anthropology might make is offering discoveries about how ethics manifest themselves inside the organisation for the people working on things. It's not, as I said, about how search engineers tame targets to deliver, for example, to subjects. It's how they triage content. And the way they triage content strikes me as being massively without any significant or salient ethical matters. But there are ethical matters that large, say, search engine companies are provided for, and it's elsewhere. And weirdly, it has to do with the battles internal to a trade called computer science. So if you want to study ethics, you don't go and study Microsoft, you don't go and study Google, you go to Cambridge University Science, Computer Science Department, or you go up the road here to the Computer Science Department here, and look and see and feel and understand the felt life of computer scientists whose trade is to abuse each other by mocking the capacity to create security around systems which they all know are essentially and ultimately always open to hacking, and that the dance of security, the dance of being ethical in terms of big data protection, is to keep the door closed for a week until it's open, and then shift it, put it in another room and close the door, shift it and put it in another room. Security is only ever short-term and temporary, and the dance, the ethics of it, is to come up with short-term solutions. The weirdness of the villainy is it's not strangers, it's people down the road, it's professors in computer science departments who are cracking open these things. Where's the ethics? That's the sort of thing that sociology or anthropology are going to deliver to these sorts of workshops.
Thank you very much.